presentation he'll give, followed by a chance for questions and answers. We'll start with the land acknowledgement. We honor the original peoples of Guelph and area. This is the ancestral land of the Acknowledgement people, the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the home of many indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. The land was and is the center of their lives and spirituality. We acknowledge their stewardship of this land throughout the ages. We commit to respectful relationships with our Indigenous neighbors and with the land. And for our guidance tonight, I'd like to mention two principles of Indigenous relationships with the land: gratitude for the countless gifts of the earth that nurture us so abundantly, and reciprocity, our obligation in return to act as caregivers for that earth and for all our relations. So now I'll introduce Rasha Abusida, who will introduce the co-sponsors of this evening.
Thank you, Liz. We would like to thank all of our co-sponsors of this evening for their great environmental efforts, specifically towards fighting climate change in Guelph. Hope to continue working together in such manner. So our list will start with thanking Council of Canadians Guelph Chapter. Emerge Guelph, thank you. Extinction Rebellion of Guelph. Green New Deal Guelph. Guelph-Wellington Coalition for Social Justice. Kairos Guelph. Ontario Clean Air Alliance. Transition Guelph and Wellington Water Watchers. Thank you all. And over to you, Evan.
Thank you, Rasha. And thank you everyone for coming this evening. We're going to really quickly run through the Guelph context on why this is causing problems in Guelph. We're going to try to get through this as quickly as possible. We can get down in the weeds afterwards, but we want to get to our main speaker as soon as possible. We have two specific climate goals in Guelph. One is the corporation of the city of Guelph, and that's all of the infrastructure that the city itself owns, from their buildings to all of their vehicles, anything that uses energy and has an impact on climate change. So that's the first one: 100% renewable energy within the corporation of the city. Then from the standpoint of the entire city, there's a goal of net zero carbon within that same time frame of 2050. And just a couple of points on climate change and what the city has done to date. The current city council has acknowledged a climate emergency. They use that language specifically, and I'll leave that to you to make any comments on it later. And current city council, their view on the expansion of the gas plants in Ontario is that this is not a municipal issue. None of the councillors have really grabbed hold of this issue. We've done a joint letter to them. We've had no official response from them. We also had a letter in the paper as well. It's very disappointed that they feel that this is not a municipal issue, and here's why. And briefly show you that all of you are very familiar with the fact that Ontario has phased out coal, and Jack's going to get down into that one. And I want to thank Jack for helping us pull up these resolutions. This one is 21 years old, where the city council actually made a motion that the city becomes a member of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. I think Jack really appreciated that at the time, but also that Ontario established emission caps setting the path to phase out coal. This was in 1999. And as he'll point out, the actual phase out didn't occur until, well, all of them didn't get shut down until 2014, if I'm not mistaken. Another motion, and this one is quite profound. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but it's profound because a municipality is giving direction to the province to say, your minister, provincially or federally, must require an environmental assessment of Ontario Power Generation, OPG's work specifically regarding these coal-fired plants. It was extremely prescriptive, and yet City Council says that this stuff, today says that none of this stuff is relevant to the municipality, and that they also said that once those environmental assessments are completed, they need to be referred to the Ontario Environmental Review Tribunal. And then a third a motion from City Council in 2007 that requested the provincial government legally create a legally binding regulation requiring the phase out of coal burning at Nanticoke. And Jack will tell you more about Nanticoke in a few minutes by 2009. And on that note, I want to hand the podium over to Jack. Jack has been in the trenches in this one for quite some time, since the mid-90s, if I'm not mistaken. And Jack's been the heart and soul of the coal phase out. If you could possibly point to anyone in the province that was profoundly at the front and center of making this happen, we have a lot. I mean, needless to say, Jack created a very big tent and brought an awful lot of people on board and was a brilliant campaigner on this thing. He's going to share some of what went on with that. But he's had a stellar career in changing massive public policy to the extent that this coal phase out was the largest climate change action in North American history up until that point. It's quite profound. And Jack, if you could unmute your microphone and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Evan. Thanks for that very kind introduction. And it's great to have the opportunity to talk tonight with people in Guelph about our new campaign, which is to phase out Ontario's gas-fired power plants by 2030. Now, this slide shows the historic and forecast greenhouse gas pollution from Ontario's electricity sector between 2005 and 2040. And the forecasts are made by the Ontario's Independent Electricity System Operator, or IESO. So thanks to the coal phase out, we had a very dramatic reduction in pollution from our electricity sector, as Evan has mentioned. Between 2005 and 2017, the greenhouse gas pollution from Ontario's electricity sector fell by 93%. So a huge reduction in greenhouse gas pollution due to the phase out of our 5 dirty coal-fired power plants. And so we hit an all-time low in 2017 in terms of greenhouse gas pollution from our electricity sector. But since 2017, the pollution from our electric industry has started to rise again. And the IESO is forecasting that the greenhouse gas pollution from our gas plants will increase by more than 300% by 2025 and by more than 400% by 2040. And if that occurs, then we will lose 35% of the greenhouse gas pollution reductions that we achieve by phasing out our dirty coal-fired power plants. Now, in order to ramp up the output and the pollution of our gas-fired power plants by more than 400%, that means that Ontario is going to have to import a lot more frack gas from Western Canada and also from Pennsylvania. And to help facilitate that ramp up in frack gas imports from Pennsylvania, Enbridge Gas is proposing to build a large pipeline in the city of Hamilton. And the really bad news about that pipeline is they're proposing to build it through a provincially significant wetland in Hamilton. Now, the pipeline will cost about $200 million. And to add insult to injury, the pipeline won't even be financially self-sustaining. So Enbridge would need to raise our gas rates by $120 million to pay for this pipeline to allow us to ramp up the output of our gas plants. And there's also a second purpose for this frack gas pipeline in Hamilton. Enbridge also wants to use it to deliver frack gas from Pennsylvania to New England, to utilities in New England. And Enbridge wants to do that because New York State won't allow a frack gas pipeline to go through New York State from Pennsylvania to New England. So clearly that doesn't make any sense if we're serious about dealing with climate change. Next slide, please. Okay, so why is the IESO forecasting that we'll need to ramp up the output of our gas plants by more than 400%? Well, there's three main reasons for this. The first reason is that they're forecasting that the demand for electricity in Ontario will grow by about 1% a year. The second reason is that the Pickering nuclear station is scheduled to close in 2024. And the third reason is that the Doug Ford government is planning to meet virtually all of our need for new electricity supply simply by ramping up the output of our gas-fired power plants. Now that raises the question, why does Doug Ford think this is a smart thing to do? And the reason why this option appeals to Doug Ford is because at the present, we have a large surplus of gas-fired generation capacity. We have a large surplus. And so at the moment, the gas plants are their output is just a small percentage of their total potential output. So that means that the financial cost of ramping up our gas-fired power plants just equals the cost of importing more fracked gas from Western Canada or Pennsylvania. And that financial cost is very low. So the financial cost of ramping up the gas plants is only about 2.3 cents a kilowatt hour. And because there's that low financial cost, Doug Ford thinks that we should meet virtually all of our need for new supply, for new electricity supply over the next 20 years, just by ramping up the gas-fired power plants, by importing more frack gas from Western Canada and Pennsylvania. Well, Doug Ford wants to ramp up the gas plants, but what we're proposing is that we should phase out the gas plants by 2030. And so why are we proposing to do this, given that the financial cost of ramping them up is low? It's because we need to do that to achieve our 2030 climate target. In fact, phasing out the gas-fired power plants is the easiest and lowest cost option for Ontario to meet its 2030 climate target. Now, according to the Auditor General, we're not on track. Ontario is not on track to achieve its 2030 climate target. So we have to do additional pollution reduction actions. And the good news is that if we phase out the gas-fired power plants, that will provide Ontario with all or virtually all of the greenhouse gas pollution reductions that we need to achieve our 2030 climate target. And if we phase out the gas-fired power plants, that will make it easier for cities like Guelph to meet their climate targets. because for Guelph to meet its climate targets, it has to promote fuel switching from fossil fuels to electricity. It has to reduce the fossil fuel use in homes and buildings by switching to electricity, and it has to reduce fossil fuel consumption in the transportation sector by switching to electricity. And to get the biggest possible climate benefit from switching to electricity, we need to have a carbon-free electricity system. So by moving to by phasing out the gas plants by 2030 and creating a 100% carbon-free Ontario electricity system, that can make it easier for Guelph to achieve its climate targets. Now, the question becomes, okay, well, how can we phase out the gas-fired power plants? Well, we're proposing a three-pronged strategy. The first prong is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency investments by reducing the demand for electricity can help reduce the need for the gas-fired power plants. The second prong is to import water power from Quebec. Hydro-Quebec has a huge surplus of water power, and at the moment they're exporting most of that surplus to the United States. These export sales to the United States are primarily on the spot market and for very low prices. And so those exports could easily be diverted to Ontario. And the third prong of our strategy is to build new wind and solar energy power plants in Ontario. And in the past, we know that wind and solar were high-cost sources of a new electricity supply. But now, thanks to technological improvements, wind and solar are very low-cost sources of new electricity supply. So that's our three-pronged strategy. Now, energy efficiency and solar and wind energy, they're examples of distributed energy resources. And distributed energy resources are small scale and they're decentralized. So under our plan, which focuses on energy efficiency and wind and solar, we can create jobs and electricity supply sources in every community of Ontario, instead of sending our dollars to Western Canada or the Pennsylvania to buy frack gas. So specifically under our plan, the government would direct the IESO to finance energy efficiency investments in Guelph and to finance wind and solar investments, in communities across Ontario, including Guelph. And so that would create good jobs in Guelph, economic activity in Guelph, and again, a much better way it's a way that actually creates jobs instead of sending Ontario dollars outside the province to purchase frack gas. Now, the traditional knock against wind and solar energy is they're intermittent. And the critics say we need gas-fired backup, gas-fired electricity generation backup for wind and solar when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. Well, the very good news is that Ontario is located right next door to Quebec, which has a giant battery that can provide backup for Ontario's wind and solar energy. And that battery is Hydro-Quebec's huge hydroelectric reservoirs. And those reservoirs can provide backup for our wind and solar energy. And in fact, there was recently a Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, report which shows that the Quebec's hydroelectric reservoirs are the lowest cost carbon-free storage option for wind and solar energy. So we're very lucky that because of our geography that we are located next door to this giant battery that can provide clean, carbon-free backup for our wind and solar energy. Okay, so now we come to the costs of carbon-free electricity. And this graph shows the costs of Ontario's carbon-free electricity options. And the bar graphs on the far left show you the lowest cost options. And at the far left, you see a bar graph for energy efficiency with 1.7 cents on top of it. So that's the cost of energy efficiency. It's the lowest cost option to keep our lights on. It only costs us 1.7 cents to save a kilowatt hour. And in terms of additional electricity supply for Ontario, the lowest cost option is Quebec water power, purchased on the spot market. The average price we pay for spot market Quebec water power is about 2.2 cents a kilowatt hour. So a very low cost option. And to put the cost of energy efficiency and Quebec water power in context, remember that I told you that the financial cost of ramping up the output of the gas plants is about 2.3 cents a kilowatt hour. So energy efficiency and Quebec water power can keep our lights on at costs that are less than or equal to ramping up the gas-fired power plants. So that's good news. Now let's turn to the cost of wind and solar electricity. And the last time that Ontario signed contracts for new wind and solar electricity, that was back in 2016. And at that time, we used a competitive procurement process to get more wind and solar energy. This wasn't through the Green Energy Act, but through a competitive procurement process. And at that time, we got wind at a cost of 8.6 cents a kilowatt hour. And we got solar at a cost of 15.7 cents a kilowatt hour. But that was 4 years ago. And in the past 4 years, the cost of wind and solar energy has fallen dramatically due to technological improvements. And if you look on the box in the top left-hand corner of the slide, that gives you the update. And recently, the government of Alberta purchased wind and solar energy at about 4 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And so that's much lower than it was in Ontario just 4 years ago. And the costs are going to continue to fall. According to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, the cost of wind and solar will fall by another 50% by 2050. But today we see the cost of wind and solar is about 4 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So that is more expensive than just ramping up the output of our existing gas-fired power plants. But the good news is that there is a way that we can actually phase out the gas-fired power plants and lower our electricity bills. And to understand why that is true, it's important to look at the cost of nuclear power. If you look at the yellow bar graph in the middle with 9.5 cents on top of it, that's how much we pay for Ontario Power Generation's nuclear power today, 9.5 cents a kilowatt hour. And if you look at the yellow bar graph at the far right with 16.5 cents on top of it, that's how much OPG, Ontario Power Generation, says it must raise its price of nuclear electricity to by 2025 to pay for the rebuilding of the Darlington nuclear station's reactors. So what these this slide shows you is that energy efficiency and renewables can all meet our electricity needs at less than half the cost of nuclear power, less than half the cost of rebuilding 10 of our aging nuclear reactors. And that shows you just how economically irrational Doug Fort's electricity plan is, because he's proposing to rebuild 10 of our aging nuclear reactors, despite the fact that we can keep our lights on at less than half the cost by investing in energy efficiency and renewables. So what this tells us is that if we aggressively promote energy efficiency and renewable energy, so that not only do they phase out the gas-fired power plants, but if they also phase out some or all of the nuclear rebuild projects, then we can also lower our electricity bills. That is, by aggressively promoting energy efficiency and renewables, we can phase out much higher cost nuclear power plants, and we can phase out the gas-fired power plants. So that means that we can actually phase out the gas-fired power plants and lower our total electricity costs by aggressively promoting energy efficiency and renewables and moving Ontario towards a 100% renewable electricity grid. So that's the good news. We can meet our greenhouse gas targets. We can phase out coal. It will phase out natural gas and lower our bills. And by doing that, we get a cleaner power system. We reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We get lower electricity costs, and we create jobs in Guelph by doing energy efficiency and by investing in solar and wind power in the city of Guelph and in many other communities across Ontario. So that's the potential good news story. Now this slide shows the logos of a number of our supporting organizations. These organizations have endorsed our call for the phase out of the gas-fired power plants by 2030. And our supporters include the David Suzuki Foundation, the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario, Emerge Guelph, and many other organizations. So far, 44 organizations are supporting our call for the phase out of the gas-fired power plants. And our goal is to get 100 supporting organizations. But we also want the support of municipalities like Guelph to call on the government of Ontario to phase out our gas-fired power plants by 2030. And municipalities can have a very profound impact on Queen's Park, on the government of Ontario, on these type of issues. And the truth of that statement has been demonstrated by Mayor Hazel McCallion. 20 years ago, in March 2000, Mayor Hazel McCallion had a press conference outside the Lakeview coal-fired power plant in Mississauga. And at that press conference, Hazel called on Premier Mike Harris to phase out coal burning at the Lakeview coal-fired power plant. And as a result of Hazel's request, exactly 1 year later, in March 2001, Ontario's Minister of the Environment, Elizabeth Whitmer, held her own press conference outside the Lakeview coal-fired power plant and announced that she was going to issue a legally binding regulation requiring the phase out of coal burning at Lakeview. And then 1 year later, in September 2002, the government of Premier Ernie Eves committed Ontario to a complete coal phase out by 2015. And so that shows you the huge impact that a municipal leader like Hazel McCallion can have on the government of Ontario on an issue about electricity, which, you know, municipalities don't have any actual jurisdiction over electric power planning in Ontario, but by providing moral leadership, they can persuade the government of Ontario to do the right thing. And not only do we have the support of Mayor Hazel McCallion, but also, as Evan noted earlier on tonight, the city of Guelph also called on the government of Ontario to phase out our coal-fired power plants. And in addition to the city of Guelph, 10 other municipalities called on the government of Ontario to phase out the dirty coal-fired power plants. So now today, we're also hoping that the city of Guelph and other Ontario municipalities will call on the government of Ontario to phase out our gas-fired power plants by 2030. So this slide shows the cover of our new report, which provides lots of extra information about how we can phase out the gas-fired power plants by 2030. So if you'd like to read the report, you can download it from our homepage, the homepage of the Clean Air Alliance. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'll be pleased to answer them.
Oh, thank you, Jack. That was, hey, Evan, is this for me right now? Thanks very much, Jack, for that like really informative presentation. I feel like I learned so much when I hear these, and it just compels me even further forward into, you know, knowing how we need to support this initiative, the Clean Air Alliance.
Thank you.
I wanted to mention to folks who are in attendance that I'm seeing a bit happening in the chat, and I'm going to try to do my best to keep abreast of it. But that this is a really great time where we can engage in a Q&A right now here while we have Jack, and while we're blessed to have Jack and his immense amount of talent. Like, I know as a campaigner, my name is Arlene Slocum. In case I haven't mentioned that, I'm from Wellington Water Watchers. We've been campaigning for many years, and this is an ongoing, challenging slog to be a campaigner. And we celebrate our successes when we have them. And you know, Jack has been at the forefront of making some really progressive advances for the environmental movement here in Ontario. And so I'm going to invite you in our audience right now to please enter any questions that you may have after that presentation, or questions that are lingering in your mind. And in the interim, I have a question that I would really love to have you answer, Jack. And I know that I've posed this question before. I so appreciate the economic analysis of how all of these, of how the energy pieces are going to come together to meet our needs in our ongoing futures. But I also have this memory of growing up in an era when the power that was coming from Quebec was a little bit under question and under challenge because of the impacts for the Indigenous communities in the area. And I would like, if you would grace us with a response around how right now that's a bit of a different situation, and how that may be actually a benefit for people in the area.
Well, yes, there were a lot of problems with the construction of the dams in Quebec, and there was a lot of opposition from First Nations, but now Hydro-Quebec has got agreements with the First Nations, and they actually profit from the power export sales. But it's very important to recognize that we are not advocating building any new dams in Quebec. We definitely don't advocate that. New dams in Quebec would be ecologically harmful. And so what we are advocating for is simply using the surplus power that is produced by the existing dams and import it. At the moment, there's a huge surplus of power and it's being exported to the United States mostly. And we say that we should be importing that power to help us phase out our gas-fired power plants. And it's also important to remember now that while it used to be cheap in Quebec to increase their electricity supply by building new dams, not only would building new dams now be ecologically harmful, but Hydro-Quebec has tapped out. They've tapped out their low-cost water power resources. And so in fact, the lowest cost source of new supply for Quebec, if they wanted new electricity supply, their lowest cost source of new supply would be wind energy, which would be about half the cost of building a new water power facility.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thanks for that, Jack. I'm seeing a question I'm seeing several questions coming in, and I think we have time to get to them. But I'm seeing one question that's related to that, so I'm going to pop it in here right now. Do you have some idea about, and this is from Jeff Overton, do you have some idea about how the hydro infrastructure would need to be upgraded to handle capacity from Quebec? And have those costs been estimated and included in the costing you've provided?
Well, yes, absolutely. We already have transmission lines connecting Quebec and Ontario, and we already do import power from Quebec, but the existing transmission lines aren't used to their full capacity. And in fact, we could triple our power imports from Quebec using the existing transmission lines. But nevertheless, given that Quebec has such a huge supply of low-cost clean water power, it does make sense for us to expand our transmission lines with Quebec. And the cost of expanding those transmission lines is very low. In fact, we could double our capacity to import power from Quebec by building a 20-kilometer new transmission line in the city of Ottawa, and that would only cost about $80 million. So yes, we should be expanding the transmission links with Quebec, and the cost of doing so is very, very low, just a very small fraction of the cost of rebuilding one nuclear reactor.
That is shocking, okay? And yet the projections, as you've shown, are completely not supporting that. I mean, you know, what the province, the current government is certainly projecting.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the current government is focused on ramping up gas-fired generation and rebuilding 10 nuclear reactors, and that doesn't make any sense from a climate point of view, and it doesn't make any sense from the point of view of lowering bills for electricity consumers. So the Ford government's electricity policy is ecologically and economically irrational.
It's so good to hear it so straight like that. So there's another question right here, and from Steve Tedesco, which is, Jack, when you quote the cost, the kilowatt per hour of ramping up gas, does that include the Enbridge pipeline costs?
No, when I said the cost was approximately 2.3 cents a kilowatt hour, that was just looking at the fuel cost, not the extra cost of the proposed Enbridge pipeline. But the fuel cost is the bulk of the cost, for sure, the bulk of the financial cost. And it's also important to remember that frack gas is a commodity, and the price does fluctuate every day. So the cost is the last time I did the calculation looking at the market price for frac gas, it's about 2.3 cents a kilowatt hour, but it could go up tomorrow or it could go down tomorrow.
Interesting. It's that unpredictable. Yeah. All right. So we have another question here from Lynn Grist, which is, are we linked up to our colleagues in Michigan who are fighting the Enbridge pipeline, in particular because it was going through the Straits of Mackinac? Do you know about that?
Well, no, I'm not intimately familiar with that battle, and no, the Clean Air Alliance is not linked up with those folks.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that just carves a new pathway forward
Yes,
for some more
absolutely.
allies along that work. I see it. All right. Let me see. So this question has come in here, and it's possibly already been answered, but we'll just say it too. Oh, Lynn has just said she'll make sure that we're connected so that we can follow those conversations forward. And he's from Liam, who says, I've come in a little late, so you may have already covered this, but where does Ontario hydropower come into this energy future? You've covered this, but maybe it's worthwhile to explain that in the way that you feel.
Well, Ontario Hydro no longer exists. It was broken up into a number of companies, including Ontario Power Generation. And there are actually 32 gas-fired power plants in Ontario that supply electricity to the Ontario transmission grid. And five of our biggest gas-fired power plants are owned by Ontario Power Generation, which is in turn owned by the people of Ontario. So Ontario Power Generation, which we all own collectively, it is the largest fossil fuel electricity generator in Ontario. So what we want to do is we want to phase out their gas-fired power plants. We want to phase out the private sector gas-fired power plants by 2030 and replace it with energy efficiency, wind and solar electricity, and Quebec water power.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. And there's one question here, which I have to say has been on my mind too, which is Ontario government seemed to be studiously ignoring power from Quebec. Why? And so this is from Ken McKay. Thanks for the question.
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. You know, Doug Ford claims to be a businessman and always out to get the best bargain for the taxpayers. He promised when he was running for election to reduce our electricity bills by 12%, but he hasn't done it. And despite the fact that he claims he's a smart businessman, he's planning to rebuild 10 of our aging nuclear reactors, which will push our electricity costs through the roof. And he's planning to do that despite the fact that, you know, the Premier of Quebec is offering him clean water power at 1/3 the cost. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So why is this happening? Well, it's happening because in Ontario, we have a very, very powerful nuclear special interest lobby. And, you know, you just have to look at the power companies in Ontario. The two biggest power companies in Ontario are Ontario Power Generation, which we own, and Bruce Power, which is privately owned. And Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power, they're both nuclear companies. That's where how they produce their power. And they supply us with, you know, they're the two largest power companies. They supply Ontario with over 80% of its electricity. And they have a very powerful influence on political actors like Doug Ford. And then their workers are members of the Power Workers Union, which is very politically powerful. And under Doug Ford's plan, the reactors will be rebuilt by companies like SNC-Lavalin, which is, as we know, is very politically influential. So that's the problem. There's a very, very powerful nuclear special interest lobby that persuades the government of Ontario, and it's not just Premier Ford, but Kathleen Wynne and was planning to do exactly the same thing. And this special nuclear special interest lobby persuades the government of Ontario to make decisions that are not in the best financial interests of Ontario's electricity consumers.
Yeah.
Jack, one of the issues I know that you didn't bring up, not that we're going to go too far down the path on this one, is small modular reactors, and I know you didn't bring it up until this point. But the reason I wanted to bring it up was that the federal minister, Seamus O'Regan, brought it up last week in the legislature, and he was very supportive and was just waxing on about what a great solution these are going to be. Can you for everyone, just give a brief explanation of SMRs as they're known and why we should be concerned about them?
Well, yeah, SMRs, they're small modular nuclear reactors. Now, as we know, nuclear power has a bad track record in Ontario, and we're rebuilding them now at a very high cost. But nuclear power is losing market share around the world, and the nuclear industry is desperate to try to reverse that. And so now their newest proposal to gain market share is to build what they call small modular nuclear reactors, which are very small scale, which could, for example, be put into an apartment building or a shopping mall in the city of Guelph. And so that's their new proposal. But there's a number of problems with the small, and they advocate it. They say it's a good solution to dealing with climate change. But there's a number of problems with small modular nuclear reactors. First, it's just a concept. It's just an idea on paper, or they haven't been designed yet. Design hasn't been approved by the nuclear regulators. So they don't exist anywhere in the world. And even according to the Canadian nuclear industry, the first pilot project won't be up and running before 2030. Well, I mean, that's just not good enough to solve the climate crisis. We have to have a dramatic reduction in greenhouse gas pollution before 2030. We can't wait for an option that might be a solution after 2030. And another good, and so at best, it would be a solution a decade from now. But it doesn't make sense to pursue this option because it's for a couple of reasons. One, first, it's slow. It won't provide emission reductions now. Two, it's very high cost. I mean, even the nuclear industry, even Seamus O'Regan's Ministry of Natural Resources admits that a small modular nuclear reactor would cost at least 16 cents a kilowatt hour. But we've seen energy efficiency only costs 1.7 cents a kilowatt hour to save electricity. Why would we pay 8 times more for a small modular nuclear reactor? And as we've seen, wind and solar now cost 4 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Why would we pay triple the price for a small modular nuclear reactor when we can have wind and solar right now at 1/3 the cost? It makes absolutely no sense. And also you have to remember that small modular nuclear reactors, like all nuclear reactors, create highly toxic radioactive waste that will last for hundreds of thousands of years. So when you go the nuclear route, the current generation maybe gets electricity for 30 years or more, but then it leaves future generations with the problem of looking after this highly toxic waste for hundreds of thousands of years. And that just doesn't make any sense, especially when we have now lower cost, cleaner, and safer options to keep our lights on. So, but once again, this option's being pushed by Doug Ford, who's advancing the interests of Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power. It's being promoted by the Premier of New Brunswick, who's promoting the interests of New Brunswick Power, which is a nuclear power company. And it's being promoted by the Premier of Saskatchewan. And that's quite understandable, because in Saskatchewan is where the uranium comes from. And so the Premier of Saskatchewan wants to create work for his uranium industry. So we understand why he's promoting it, but nevertheless, it's not in the best interest of the climate or electricity consumers.
Jack, didn't mean to raise your blood pressure on this one. It always raises my blood pressure when I think of these pieces. But one of the things I've been reading recently is that 30 reactors have come offline and shut down permanently around the world in since 2018. That number just blew me away. I mean, those are individual reactors. So countries all around the world are getting out of nuclear. They're racing towards efficiency, renewables, storage, looking at all the other options that are out there, with the exception probably of France, but even France, I think, may have been shutting some of their systems down too. What I don't understand is, and I get the politics of what you just said, between New Brunswick, Ontario, and Saskatchewan, there are political reasons why they want to support nuclear energy, but that's the case in other jurisdictions too. So why is it that the majority of countries around the world are shutting down? Why does the nuclear industry have such a hold of us in Canada?
Well, in Ontario, I mean, nuclear at the moment provides us with a large proportion of our electricity. It's only France that has more nuclear in its electricity supply mix than Ontario. So we, for historical reasons, have become very, very dependent on nuclear. And so the nuclear lobby is much stronger than in Ontario than it is in many other parts of the world. And it's fighting as hard as it can to keep its market share. And so far it's being very successful, as we see by the fact that, Premier Ford is proceeding with the rebuilding of 10 nuclear reactors, despite the fact that it'll prevent him from keeping his promise to reduce our electricity bills by 12%.
Technically, just to give people a picture of the size of these things, my understanding is that the smallest SMR that they're talking about is about 10 megawatts. The largest is somewhere around 300. To put that into scale, the highest peak demand in the summer, the average highest peak demand in the summer in Guelph is about 250 megawatts. So one of these SMRs on the large size could actually power a place the size of Guelph. And imagine that it would go down to as small as 10 megawatts. I always feel compelled to do that, because we tend sometimes to throw around these these numbers, and we got to put it into context. I should also say, Jack, and in my intro, I was remiss in saying this, is that Jack is an economist, so please take a run at him on the numbers. I can guarantee you that he's going to come out on top of all of that. Arlene, do we have any other questions, or should we switch to some of the things that we're considering doing for the next steps?
I think there aren't no other questions except for one that's pressing in my mind right now too. And Jack, I know how critical you were in the phasing out of the coal plants, and at the time, one of the really relevant hooks was the health impacts of the emissions from the coal firing plants, and clearly right now we're in a phase where climate impacts are on the forefront of everyone's mind, and so finding ways to minimize the impact on all of our emissions such that we can have a livable climate, makes the proposition that your Clean Air Alliance is putting forward makes so much sense. And within that too, I'm thinking about even a slightly different angle, which is just that our impact on the environment, whether it's like from a financial point of view, or just like our relationship with the environment and our impact on the negative impacts that we have. And the question around this is another part, I think, of the proposal, which is that we actually need to really consider a reduction in our energy requirements in order to, you know, meet the goals that we're trying to reach. So it's wonderful and really interesting for me to look at this financial analysis and the way that we can reduce things in the really ridiculous proposals that the current government is putting forward to reach these, which are going to just cost so much on every level. But what also are the other ways that we can significantly impact the reduction of our energy needs? I would love a moment for that, if you could.
Well, yeah, energy efficiency is the best way to keep our lights on because it's by far the lowest cost. And there's just a absolutely huge potential for cost-effective energy efficiency in Ontario. And it's not just people like us who are saying it, but the Ontario Energy Board and the Independent Electricity System Operator, you know, they published a report that shows there's a huge untapped potential for energy efficiency in Ontario. And we should be pursuing that. And what most people don't realize is that since about 2005, because of energy efficiency, the total demand for electricity in Ontario has fallen, and it's fallen significantly. Since 2005, our total annual electricity consumption has fallen by about 10%. And that's occurred despite the fact that we've had large population growth and a large growth in our gross domestic product. So energy efficiency is actually happening now. Our demand for electricity has been falling since about 2005. And if we would just seriously pursue it, we could get much larger reductions. And that's what we should be doing because it's the cleanest source, it's the lowest cost source, the best way to lower our bills. And of course, like energy efficiency, like home energy retrofits or building retrofits, I mean, they can create jobs in every single community in Ontario. And a much better investment for our consumer dollars and for our planet than sending our money out to Alberta or Pennsylvania to buy frack gas. So, I mean, you know, we can have our cake and eat it too. It's just, if we do what's rational, we can get a big reduction in pollution and a big reduction in our electricity bills.
And unfortunately, what's rational doesn't always have the big lobby dollars that we see that some of the other very organized sectors do. So this leads to the very obvious next question which is what can we in our municipality do? And maybe, Evan, that's where you're gonna jump in.
Well, I mean, that's the thing too. I mean, I just like to, you know, go back to the coal phase out. When we launched the campaign for the coal phase out back in 1997, you know, at that time, coal was providing Ontario for about 25% of our electricity, and we had a progressive conservative government. Mike Harris was the premier, and so when we launched our campaign for the phase out of the dirty coal plants, I mean, all the sophisticated people said, you know, Jack, you don't have a chance. There's just absolutely no way you're going to persuade the Mike Harris government to phase out coal. But we did, and we did it very quickly. And despite the fact that, you know, we were up against, at that time, the old Ontario Hydro, which owned all the coal plants and was one of the biggest electric utilities in North America. And we did it by creating this huge coalition of groups. We had a coalition of over 90 organizations, including groups from Guelph and the city of Guelph. And we got the support of municipal politicians like Hazel McCallion. And so that's what we have to do again. And if we can build this broad coalition of support from organizations like Emerge Guelph and from cities like the city of Guelph, then we can do it again. We can beat the special interest lobby and get Ontario and Guelph on the right track to reducing to meeting our climate targets and to lowering our bills.
That's fabulous, Jack. And to remind you too that there were 10 groups involved with putting this event on tonight. And I wanted to go back just briefly before we get into these next items, Jack, about the issue of conservation and efficiency. In the work that we've done, one of the pieces that we found is that everyone wants to race to the sexy stuff, the solar and the wind. And the conservation stuff is boring. It's quite often, it's invisible to people. Politically, it's hard to get a politician to stand in front of a house that's been well insulated and somehow people are going to look at it as a photo opportunity. And I can't help but think that we always fall into this trap that we race to the other cooler stuff that goes with it. And getting back to your question, Arlene, that on the conservation and efficiency side, remember, the first part of that, 20 to 50%, we've seen reductions in some households that aggressive strictly by through behavioral change. That might sound like a heck of a lot, but there's an awful lot, as Jack pointed out, there's a heck of a lot of room out there. The first 20% is extremely easy, and a lot of it can be done on the behavioral side or an extremely low side end of that. And I can't underscore that one enough. The other piece of this puzzle on the gas side of it is that the provincial government actually had a regulation on the books that was going to make it illegal to have any new buildings constructed in 2030 in the building code. It would prevent new buildings constructed starting in 2030 that have combustion equipment in the homes. And by combustion equipment, that would mean a natural gas furnace or a natural gas a hot water heater, or for that fact, natural gas fireplace or a wood fireplace as well. And in a matter of about 2 or 3 months, it got pulled off the books because of that lobby of the natural gas lobby. The only way we can get there is massive amounts of insulation, sealing, good ventilation in those buildings, and then switching to electricity with air source heat pumps that I won't go into right now. But what I will do, Jack, and would really appreciate your thoughts. I'm going to do a quick screen share here. And where are we? Here we are. Just really quickly to go through these is these items are relevant to what Jack is talking to us about right now, and also relevant to here in Guelph. To sound terribly cliche, this is about thinking globally and acting locally. Here's what we can do locally to work towards this end, is that we need to get the city to adopt yearly targets towards the 100% renewable energy target, yearly targets towards the net zero carbon target. And we need to accomplish these goals much earlier than 2050. And then the last piece is Jack's piece, that we need to demand positive climate action from the province on phasing out fossil fuel burning. Your thoughts on these, Jack?
Well, they're all great. Absolutely support them.
That was too easy. You're a pushover.
Well, we think the same way.
And on that note, I have to ask you, what are other communities doing in this area on the gas phase out?
Okay, so we're starting our campaign now to approach municipalities, and with our partners in Hamilton, like Environment Hamilton and Hamilton 350, will be approaching the Hamilton City Council, and we have allies who are working on this issue in Kingston, and the City of Toronto will be receiving a report from their staff this fall about additional actions that Toronto can do to meet its climate targets. And when that report comes before council, Councillor Jennifer McKelvey has told us that she will move a motion requesting the City of Toronto to endorse the phase out of the gas-fired power plants by 2030. So, you know, we're starting to reach out to municipalities and to gain their support. So what our work plan is for this fall is to ask municipalities to pass resolutions requesting the government of Ontario to phase out the gas-fired power plants by 2030. And as you know, when we were working on the coal phase-out campaign, 11 municipalities endorsed our call, and so we want to get as many municipalities as we can to endorse the call for the phase of the gas-fired power plants, because when municipalities pass resolutions like this, people at Queen's Park, they listen.
Well, that's pretty powerful. It sounds like we're in really good company at this point. And I guess my reason for asking it, Jack, is that it's always good to be able to go to council members. And I should have mentioned, I didn't get a chance to do a shout out. The Councillor James Gordon was on the call, but he had to head out a bit early. But he caught your stuff, Jack. So I think you might have gotten to him there. We know that James is definitely sympathetic to all of this. But let me just flip to the second part of this, if I can get my screen to work. And there we go. The next steps, what you can do, and this is what we're hoping that we can do for all of you that are on the call this evening. We will be sending you out an email that will give you a link to this webinar this evening, but we want you to confirm your interest in being involved with the campaign to get this gas phase out with that Guelph twist, that it provides us with a multi-pronged approach, both in getting the city to come up with real targets and at the same time to endorse a provincial phase out of gas-fired plants. We'll definitely connect with you via email, and we are going to go ahead and start organizing meetings with local politicians. Our MPP has already reached out to us and said that he wants to talk to us about this. Mike has been actually speaking about this, I know, Jack, with you an awful lot, and in the legislature at Queen's Park as well. And what Jack has also offered to do for us is that technically they'll help us build a specific online action center that's Guelph specific for the work that we're doing here. And on that note, Jack, I want to introduce our last speaker for the night, and that's my colleague Jaden Lasachuk from Emerge Guelph as well. And I'm going to stop sharing so that Jaden can join us now. Jaden,
yes.
Are you there?
Jack, I just wanted to say a heartfelt thank you from myself and the other folks at Emerge, as well as I'm sure on behalf of all of the people who've attended tonight to listen to you speak about the history of the energy sector in Ontario, where we're currently going, and some of these issues that we're facing. You've outlined with such, grace and ease the complexities and the technicalities geographically with the issues that we're facing, and moving forward what some of those next steps are. And for me personally, I often struggle to understand and wrap my mind around the complexities of the economic side of things. And you did a wonderful job of outlining that tonight, and have been able to sort of align that with mental things, which to me seems so easy to understand. So thank you very much for that, just on behalf of myself and the folks who've attended tonight. And of course, we want to extend a thank you to all of the people who have attended tonight and who are considering committing to working on this campaign with us. We really appreciate your support, both in attending tonight and your support moving forward. It means a lot. And in the future, if anyone is looking to continue supporting the work that Emerge does, next Wednesday at 7 p.m., we'll host another event with Dr. Ingrid Waldron from Dalhousie University, talking about environmental racism. And Jack, you are, of course, welcome to join us at that as well. And we just want to conclude tonight with saying another great big thank you, and we appreciate the work that you do and are continuing to do, and we can't wait to see where this goes.
Thank you. Thank you for your support.
Thanks, Jack.